I'm Katie. I'll be moderating the conversation. I'm with the Center for Countering Digital Hate. Today, we will hear from CCDH's CEO and founder, Imran Ahmed, as well as Amy Spitalnick, CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, otherwise known as JCPA. For more than 80 years, JCPA has served as the leading voice for the American Jewish community on building broad-based coalitions and strong relationships across communities. JCPA mobilizes the Jewish community and works in coalition with national partners representing diverse constituencies in pursuit of a just and democratic society where all communities are safe and free, building on the understanding that there is no Jewish safety without inclusive democracy and no inclusive democracy without Jewish safety. Their CEO, Amy, is a nationally recognized leader on countering anti-Semitism, hate, and extremism, as well as protecting democracy. Amy previously served as executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Our other speaker today is Imran Ahmed, CEO and founder of CCDH. CCDH works to stop the spread of online hate and false information through innovative research, public campaigns, and policy advocacy. CCDH holds social media companies accountable and responsible for their business choices by highlighting their failures, educating the public, and advocating for change from platforms and governments to protect our communities. Imran is one of the world's foremost authorities on disinformation and extremism on social media. He advises legislators across the globe on how to regulate digital spaces, including the US Congress, the European Commission, and the UK government. Imran was inspired to start the center after seeing the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK and the murder of his colleague, Joe Cox, by a white supremacist who had been radicalized in part online. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that story later in the conversation. We're about to get started. Some housekeeping. We'll spend the first part of this webinar with a conversation between Amy and Imran discussing the groundbreaking report that we're releasing today. And then we'll end with a Q&A from the audience. So if you have any questions, either now or later, pop them in the chat. We have moderators who will pull questions from the chat, and they'll come up again at the end of the conversation. They can be for Amy, Imran, or both of them. And the earlier you get in your questions, the more likely it is that we get to them at the end. So start thinking of your questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Imran to talk about this new report.
Thanks, Katie. It's a real pleasure to be here with my friend and colleague Amy, who I've been working on anti-Semitism for 9 years now, after the sudden rise of anti-Semitism on the political left in the UK, where I was working at the time in Parliament for the Labour Party. The question of leaving aside the moral outrage of anti-Semitism in the first instance, it is a particularly powerful and rich area to study because it shows us some really important fundamental facts about human beings and about the technology that we have today. First of all, it taught me I've known from the beginning that lies and hate are inextricably interlinked. Historically, we know that the blood libel 2,000 years ago, the protocols in the 20th century, and the Great Replacement theory in the 21st century have always underpinned the creation of hatred against Jewish people. Another point that's really important is that anti-Jewish hatred has, as a result of its long history, it has become the semiotics, the sort of the symbols, the language, the pattern of how we hate in America today. And I myself have lived in America for 5 years. It's become incredibly clear to me how anti-Semitism is written through all the different work that we do at CCDH. When we were looking at anti-vax disinformation in the pandemic, anti-Semitic symbols and language were used throughout that. And then finally, and I think what is so why this is so urgent to us is because there is a clear linkage between the proselytization, the spreading of hate, and real world harm. And it has led to truly terrible things in our real world, whether it's the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or it is even the massacre of Muslims in Christchurch, where the man behind that was inspired by the Great Replacement theory. And that's why we study this area. It's why it's one of our major areas of focus. And it's why we worked with Amy, who I think of all the civil rights leaders I have met in the last 5.5 years of working here, really gets that hate is eternal. We can fight to beat it back, but it will find the weakest vector in our society and colonize that. And the weak vector now is social media. That is the superhighway of hatred in America today, that is spreading it far and wide, and in ways that are unique to social media, that the economics of those platforms, zero cost to the producer to distribute a message to a billion people a billion times. And that is unprecedented. It's the nuclear age of disinformation that underpins hate. Unprecedented scale. So this study was a year-long investigation from February 2024 to January 2025, in which we studied hundreds of thousands of anti-Semitic posts to try and look for patterns. We classified types of hateful disinformation and hate and outright hate into 6 categories: Jewish control, satanic conspiracy, Holocaust denial, distortion, and then abuse, character attacks, dehumanization, and violent speech. We built an AI classifier that was able to ingest 680,000 anti-Semitic posts and spit out what categories they fitted into with unprecedented accuracy at incredible speed. These posts, these 680,000 posts, had accrued 193 million views, showing systemic amplification of that anti-Semitism. What we found was interesting on a technical level. Conspiracies dominate. About 59% of the posts were conspiracy theories, but they drove around 73% of the likes, so they get really high engagement. Jewish control conspiracies alone were 30% of posts and 44% of likes. The second thing we noticed was that X's moderation is failing at scale. So only 1% of anti-Semitic posts received community notes. Now, community notes are a feature where you can add a comment to an existing post to say this is wrong. And we were told this was the future of moderation. We don't need human moderators anymore. Community notes will replace that. Well, they're 99% ineffective, even on things that everyone knows are untrue. And by the time that notes actually get to the post, they've already been seen millions of times. So of the 1% that had posts, only 22% of the views saw the post with the note. And the final thing that I think was genuinely fascinating was the economics of this. So on X, one of the things that Elon Musk did to try and drive traffic and produce and creators to his site was to start paying them essentially for views, because every time they generate a view, that's a chance to place an advert. Every 7 or so posts you can place an ad. And you can say to yourself, these ads are tiny amounts of money. 98% of Meta's revenue is advertising in exactly the same way. And Mark Zuckerberg has made himself worth just, over $200 billion. And he's younger than I am. So it shows you how enormous this business is. The global digital advertising market is now around $1 trillion. So this is a phenomenal space to be in. So what happens with these influencers? Well, 10 influencers alone drove 32%, a third of all likes in our sample set. 9 of those 10 influencers had more followers on X than any other platform, showing that it's crucial to their promotion. 6 out of 10 were verified, 5 out of 10 were running ads, and 3 out of 10 also had monetized subscriptions where you could subscribe to their feed and get additional content. We think that the ads next to those influencers generate tens of thousands of dollars of annual revenue for X just for 10 people. So think about the thousands that are out there. But it also encourages others to come in and produce too, because if something's making money, others are going to jump in on it. Um, so our conclusions were very simple. X is amplifying anti-Semitism at a massive scale, despite Elon Musk's promises to limit the hate speech visibility. He himself has said, I want to give freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. Um, and Musk also said that no consequences for hate would create a hellscape. His specific phrase was, Twitter obviously cannot become a free-for-all hellscape where anything can be said with no consequences. Well, that's precisely what he's created, is that when it comes to anti-Semitism, X is a hellscape. Then there's something else we know. A safe space for extreme anti-Semitism is basically a hostile environment for Jewish people. So in public discourse in America, Jewish people know that if they enter a platform, which is the primary space where we share information, we negotiate values, we negotiate what we believe to be true as a society, Jewish people's voices have to overcome the hurdle of an incredible amount of abuse and hostility before they can actually speak out. And when they do, of course, they receive abuse as well. So that is the research that we've done, and I'm really proud of the work that we've done together with JCPA on this. And I'll hand over to Amy now.
Thank you so much, Imran, and really, really grateful for the opportunity to work with the CCDH team on this. For so many reasons. I think some of the folks here on this call today might have joined us nearly 2 years ago when Imran and I did a webinar in the aftermath of October 7th on what it meant to navigate hate online that so many of us were seeing skyrocketing in those immediate weeks. And what we now know nearly 2 years later, and nearly a decade after this first spike in hate crimes and broader anti-Semitism and extremism that's become so normalized, is that all of those incidents were really harbingers or previews of the broader normalization of hate and extremism, including, and I would say especially, anti-Semitism on platforms like X. And it might feel funny to focus in on X in a moment like this, because frankly, I think so many Jews and so many others have actually run away screaming from the platform for the reasons Imran just described. I take a look at my mentions very infrequently these days, and when I do, I'm also incentivized to do the same. But it matters because we see how what's happening on these platforms have real world consequences. It shapes how people perceive the world. It shapes how online hate and bigotry can translate into real world violence and extremism that has become more and more pervasive, targeting Jews and so many other communities. And it ultimately leads to a climate in which Jews and frankly all communities in our very democracy are facing unprecedented levels of threat. And so while focusing on X on a platform where I imagine so many people who are on this call right now might not even be engaging anymore for the reasons that we're discussing, it's so crucial that we be clear-eyed about how this all manifests. And it's important to understand what our report found in the context of the broader moment of rising anti-Semitism. As a Jewish American, I think many of us are feeling like the threats are coming from all directions right now. We're already seeing rising hate crimes. We saw the cycle of anti-Semitic white supremacist violence in Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway and El Paso and Buffalo and Christchurch, which targeted, of course, Jews, including the deadliest attack on our community in US history in Pittsburgh, but so many other communities as well. And then turbocharged after October 7th, a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism on the far left, including increasingly violent anti-Semitism manifesting in the attacks on Governor Josh Shapiro's home in Pennsylvania during Passover, the firebombing of the Boulder rally, and the shooting at the Capitol Jewish Museum, all in the last few months alone. And so it's really hard not to feel like the threats are coming from all directions. And what we know in so many of these cases, whether it's the cycle of white supremacist anti-Semitic violence or the more recent post-October 7th violence that we're discussing, is that online conspiracy theories, tropes, and hate have led to real world consequences. It is impossible to separate what happens on platforms like X from what happens in the real world to Jews and so many other communities. And we're also oftentimes being offered false choices in terms of how we can deal with this. We're told, for example, that on the political right now, we can't confront anti-Semitism without undermining our core democratic norms and values and other institutions. And on the far left, we're being offered a choice where we're being told we can't live proudly as Jews, we can't have a connection to the Jewish homeland in a way that is also consistent with democratic and humanitarian values. And all of this reinforces the fact that anti-Semitism as this conspiracy theory, as this form of hate, really thrives and grows on these false choices and false binaries by pitting us against one another, by setting up zero-sum frameworks and making it seem as if that the only path forward is to divide our communities, sow distrust in our institutions, and ultimately undermine the very fabric of our democracy. And the research that we've seen, not just what we see thriving on X as our report details, but what we've seen from partners like the University of Chicago and so many others, is that these false binaries, these conspiracy theories, the zero-sum polarized way of thinking is inextricably linked with people's willingness not just to engage in anti-Semitism more broadly, but to translate that hate and extremism into real-world violence. And so we know that all of these ideas are inextricably linked. And one of the core tools we have is to confront it at the source, at the place where it is spreading so rapidly right now, and being given a platform that that, as our report details, is unlike nearly any other platform it's had in, I would say, not just recent history, but any history. And so the goal here is to not just be clear-eyed about what that threat is, but to make clear the obligation of all of the actors, whether it's the platforms themselves, whether it's local, state, and federal officials who all have a role to play here, and frankly, whether it's each of us who have a role to play in how we engage on social media and empower our families and our colleagues and our neighbors and friends to engage, to do so in a way that understands what is happening here, that is clear-eyed about the threats, and that pushes back against this way in which anti-Semitism and broader hate and extremism have been given such a turbocharged platform on X and more broadly in recent years.
Thanks, Amy. So let's get started on this conversation. Imran, the report focuses specifically on X. Can you talk about why that is and what makes this a unique problem when talking about anti-Semitism and extremism?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a number of reasons, X is a particularly important platform. I mean, anti-Semitism exists, in all the different platforms, and we've studied them all. We find it present, but I think X has become a unique case because it is actively driving the growth of anti-Semitism influencers by rewarding them with amplification and monetization. Our research shows, as I said, that 9 out of 10 of the most impactful anti-Semitism influencers have more followers on X than anywhere else. And X is rewarding and amplifying their content by giving them reach verification. So, a sign of essentially being kosher, a sort of the Elon heckscher, saying that this is someone that you should be listening to, and even revenue. And I want to make the point, like, every platform is relevant. If you are, CCDH spends a lot of time thinking like the bad guys, essentially. We think about how we would use each platform, where the vulnerabilities are, where the opportunities are. So like Facebook, for example, is really powerful for the drip of disinformation seeded into people's news feeds over a long period of time that recolors the lens through which they see the world. X's power is really about creating social proof that something is popular. Like, the mathematics of that platform allow the generation of rapid social proof that also then alters every other organ of our society. So it affects the way the media report on things. It affects the way that politicians think about it. It has an incredibly rapid normative effect on our society. And I think this is what Amy was talking about. And we've studied in depth the mechanisms by which the frequency with which you see something. It's called the illusory truth effect in our psychology. Like, if we see something frequently, we think it's normal. And that is really powerful neurologically in human beings because we're a pattern recognition species. I'm raising children, I've got a 1-year-old, and watching her brain see patterns and slowly kind of realize that's the way things work. That's the way our brains work, full stop. Neural networks work, full stop. Repetition, frequency equals normalization and acceptance. And that's why I think it's particularly troubling to us, because it has become the main stage for anti-Semitism, where hate is normalized and elevated rather than contained and pushed to the fringes of society. And that dynamic, bringing the fringes into the center, look at what it's doing. So that's why we focused on X in this instance.
Thanks, Imran. Amy, I have a question that kind of builds on that. But before we get to that, I do want to remind our listeners and our viewers, if you have questions, if questions come up during this conversation, drop them in the Q&A section of the Zoom. So Amy, the temperature of our country feels higher than it has been, in recent memory. The murder of Charlie Kirk has fueled a debate on political violence, but it didn't start with his murder. This year alone, as you mentioned, we've seen the arson on Governor Shapiro's house and violent attacks against Jews in DC and Boulder. You also led the successful lawsuit against the neo-Nazis who attacked Charlottesville in 2017. What have you learned and seen about how unchecked extremism online translates to real world violence? And how does this understanding of X and the role it plays in platforming anti-Semitism help us counter that political violence that we've been seeing lately?
Yeah, thank you. I think, as I said earlier, it's impossible to separate these questions at a certain point. And what has become so pervasive over the last year didn't come out of nowhere. We've seen this building over the last decade, this rise in increasingly normalized hate and extremism, conspiracy theories, and broader hate that once felt fringe and has been moved wholly to the mainstream of our political and social media and other discourse. As we detail in the report, and as I'm sure many folks here have been following, ideas like Jews being an all-controlling power seeking to replace our electorate or the white race 10 years ago would have been unimaginable in terms of our political discourse. And frankly, when I saw Nazis chanting that in Charlottesville, I had no idea what they meant. A decade later, we've seen those conspiracy theories and ideas move wholly into the mainstream of our political discourse, in many ways through social media and through the broader normalization of these concepts. And so we can't separate what happens online from what happens in the real world. In particular, I can talk about what we saw in Charlottesville, which in so many ways was a harbinger of what we've now seen, including, for example, just the other week, the murder of Charlie Kirk by what appears to be a highly online individual who was also radicalized in a variety of ways by social media and memes and other content in a way that we still don't fully understand what motivated him, other than the fact that he was extremely online. But in Charlottesville 8 years ago, when we saw Nazis with torches marching, chanting "Jews will not replace us," violently attacking people, the lawsuit my prior organization brought specifically makes clear that that wasn't an accident, that it was planned meticulously in advance. And how it was planned was through social media, through platforms like X and Facebook and Discord especially, where not only were these neo-Nazis and white supremacists engaging in the planning of this violence, and all of that evidence is still online for folks to see, but also specifically using platforms like X to recruit and engage new people so that they too would join the cause, not just online, but ultimately in the real world, descending on Charlottesville that horrible weekend in August of 2017. And as we saw subsequently, really fueling a cycle of white supremacist anti-Semitic violence in which each attack inspired the next one. We know that there are deep, disturbing connections between the violence in Charlottesville, the violence in other places. The Pittsburgh shooter, responsible for the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in US history, specifically engaged with some of the Charlottesville defendants from our lawsuit. The Christchurch shooter painted onto his gun the symbol called the fashtag that was promoted online, popularized online by some of the Charlottesville defendants. Many of these shooters in their quote unquote manifestos and other content specifically cite back to social media posts and online content from prior attackers. And so we see how social media is the tool through which the cycle of violence continues. Each attack, each instance of violent hate inspires the next one and is being given outsized platform because of failed content moderation and other policies on the part of the social media platforms who should be catching this before it happens. The X's, the Facebooks, the Discords of the world, right? They should have been able to catch the fact that there were neo-Nazis planning a weekend of violence on their platforms, but they didn't. Or if they did, they did nothing about it. And so, again, we know that none of this happens in a vacuum, that it has real world consequences, and that each inspires the next. And our obligation is to not only understand that, to call it out, but to understand that that goes hand in hand with this broader normalization of the very same ideas and conspiracy theories that might not be as obvious and explicit as some of this online content is, but when we hear political actors reinforcing these ideas, talking about replacement and invasion, talking about Jewish or Zionist control, talking about some of the same ideas that underpin this more explicit online extremism, it becomes a reinforcing cycle in which each act of hate fuels the next, inspires the next, and makes it far more normalized than we ever could have imagined it to be a decade ago.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, that's, as somebody who my own social media sends me down rabbit holes of puppies and cooking videos, it's a good reminder that on the other side of the internet is this really dark part that people like me don't always see. So this is a really stark reminder.
More puppies and cooking videos for all of us, and
Yeah,
less
that would be ideal.
anti-Semitism.
You make that point, but some influencers are smart enough to know that that's how the
Exactly.
internet works for some people. So, like, we were studying one influencer where 1/3 of their posts were cute puppies and cats and stuff, because what they were doing was once you liked the cat or the dog post, you then started getting their content more frequently. So you're
Exactly.
having the seeding of, I mean, bad guys are always thinking about how to weaponize even the sort of the benevolent aspects of algorithms too.
Yeah, yeah, that's sick. And it sounds like they're way too easy to manipulate. Can have either of you, I mean, you've kind of touched on this, especially you, Amy, but can you share, your own personal experience online and stories from your communities about how this harassment bleeds into the lives of people in your life?
Yeah. I can look, I mean, I've largely been checked out from X for many reasons, including and especially this one, which is that, and this started long before I took my role leading a Jewish organization a few years ago, but certainly it was a platform that also, in many ways, continued to give outsized access and influence to neo-Nazis and white supremacists who were particularly targeting me and my prior organization during the Charlottesville litigation. And so you just need to look at the the mentions of a Jewish person, a Jewish woman in particular, I will say, where for especially the last few years, it's just been filled with the most vitriolic, violent death, rape, and other threats simply for sharing, you know, what I think many of us would agree are fairly straightforward views on anti-Semitism and extremism and how we counter it. And so, in particular, I think back to October 8th of 2023, the day after October 7th, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish people in US history. And there's so much to talk about it the 2 years since and what needs to happen now in terms of the cycle of hate that's really skyrocketed as following October 7th and the start of the war. But on October 8th, a day where the war had not really even started yet, when Jews around the world were mourning what was such a horrific day, I remember tweeting something very, very general about sort of the emotional and intergenerational response many Jews were feeling to seeing Jews ripped from their homes, kidnapped, murdered, and otherwise attacked, and how that triggers deep intergenerational emotional responses in many Jews. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and this was something I was hearing from Jews all over the country that day as we were grappling with trying to understand what had happened. And very clearly, I was being swarmed with the most, both, I think, authentic and inauthentic attacks from real anti-Semites and many bots amplifying them, intended to effectively discount what we were naming as real anti-Semitism and advance a view or advance the understanding that there was that what had happened on October 7th was acceptable and that many, many people supported it. And the goal of that is, as Imran described earlier, is to shape perceptions, to shape media's perception, to shape public perception. It's to make Jews and other vulnerable minorities feel isolated and alone, which is a core tactic of extremism. And it's ultimately to increase polarization and pit communities against one another, which we know has also been a core tactic of extremists, especially in the aftermath of October 7th, and using the real fear and pain many communities are in as a tool to do so. And so seeing that play out on October 8th at a time when I think many of us kind of assumed, the very least, there was going to be broad-based understanding of how horrible what had happened was, seeing how it played out just reinforced precisely how X in particular, but these platforms more broadly, create the vehicle to both provide, I think, unrealistic pictures of where people are and reinforce and further normalize some of the very hate and extremism intended to pit us against one another and further isolate us. And of course, this has happened in various forms over and over and over again, not just in the last 2 years, but frankly, long before that, as I mentioned earlier. And so understanding, as we all are online consuming social media, how this is a deliberate tactic, that it's not a reflection of reality. And in particular, I remember something Imran and I have both discussed often, our instincts to want to engage with it, to call it out, actually only end up reinforcing it and amplifying it in an algorithm that incentivizes that sort of engagement. It's so important for us as consumers, and particularly as Jewish Americans and others in this moment, to understand what the goal is there and to resist those instincts, as painful and hard as it might be.
Yeah, and we aren't. So CCDH, I think about half of our senior leadership team are Jewish, but we serve a number of different communities. Like a lot of our work is looking at harms to kids. So like we're thinking about parents, we're thinking about African American populations, LGBTQ plus, various different ways in which social media causes harm. And we've spent so much time listening to individuals, communities, organizations that have been, harassed, threats, slurs, doxing, intimidation. Um, it all really, there's a question I've been trying to answer for 9 years, which is, so I mean, 9 years ago when I was working in Britain in the referendum, the EU referendum, where there was a proliferation of conspiracy theories and hate. It's the first time that we saw a coordinated digital disinformation and hate affecting British electoral processes. And in particular, there was a version of the Great Replacement theory that was being spread about in the UK. And a man who had imbibed lots of those theories, those lies, took a homemade firearm and a hunting knife, and he shot and stabbed and beat my colleague Jo Cox, who was a 41-year-old mother of two, to death. That sort of thing doesn't happen in my country. And so I've been trying to answer a question for 9 years. How is it that someone can be so filled of lies that he would think it would be okay to murder a young woman? And the second question is, and this is the question that I know the answer to, and I'm trying to provide a solution to through the advocacy that we do at CCDH, which is, how on earth do we think it's okay to profit from that?
Yeah, that's a really chilling story. And so this report breaks down anti-Semitism into different categories. Can you explain how the conspiratorial anti-Semitism is different from demonization, and how you see these two forms manifesting themselves? And I'll give that to Amy and then Imran after.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to understand anti-Semitism more broadly, to understand how we sort of broke it down in this report, because they're deeply connected. So of course, anti-Semitism operates like so many forms of hate, hating Jews because of who we are, what we look like, how we pray or don't pray, or ultimately demonizing us as other or bad or different. And we can talk more about sort of the specific ways in which that played out in the the posts that were reviewed as part of this report. What's also unique about anti-Semitism, and we've talked about this or alluded to it in various ways over the last half hour, is that it operates as this sort of insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory rooted in tropes and lies around Jewish control and power. And that's where it's sometimes easy to understand when it's right, when it's Jews control X or Jews will not replace us. X being not Twitter, but Jews control whatever thing. Although I'm sure there are those still actually arguing that we somehow control X despite it being such a rampant manifestation of anti-Semitism as well. And what's unique about anti-Semitism is this conspiratorial nature, which makes it sometimes both sometimes harder for people to identify as anti-Semitism, right? This idea that there is Jewish money or control or foreign influence or something else like that shaping how our politics work, the demographic changes in our country, the elections being stolen, public policy, Hollywood, our financial systems. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we know that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories tend to perform disproportionately well on social media because they reinforce these false binaries, this polarized way of thinking that has in many ways been inextricably linked with the broader rise in political violence and extremism. And social media is a uniquely fertile place for this to manifest. And it's what makes anti-Semitism such a salient wedge across the political spectrum because it operates as this conspiracy theory really rooted in these ideas that we should be questioning and distrusting our institutions, questioning and distrusting other communities, and ultimately sowing that sort of distrust and polarization in a way that social media is so primed to serve as a platform for. And so we have to understand anti-Semitism both as these direct sort of personal or demonizing attacks against Jews, Jews having horns, satanic blood rituals, however you want to think about it, and understand how those lies and tropes oftentimes then are used to fuel the broader conspiratorial anti-Semitism that underpins not just direct attacks against Jews, but these broader attacks on so many communities in our democracy rooted in this distrust and this polarization.
And Imran, can you talk a little bit about how specifically that conspiratorial anti-Semitism online, why it's so effective and why it's so dangerous?
And conspiracy theories are really powerful they work really well on social media because they drive engagement. And so there's two factors worth talking about here. One is the fact that, Amy said that she and I have talked about this a lot, but the irony of the business model of social media companies, or not the irony, it's not ironic, it's just outrageous, is that engagement, even when you are saying this is wrong, this is disgusting, equals amplification. And there's a myth about conspiracy theories. The myth in conspiracy theories is that at the heart of every conspiracy theory is a nugget of truth. That's not the way it actually works. In terms of the construction of a conspiracy theory, a lie is at the heart of it. The truth is used to mask the lie. And there may be nuggets of truth put in there, but really at the heart, they're asking you to make a leap of faith to believe that, Jews have control, or Jews are satanic, or Jews are whatever else, and Jews want to kill Palestinian babies, or whatever else, drink blood. And so there's always a lie at the heart of it. And because there's a lie at the heart of it, typically, as well, it will be a non-falsifiable hypothesis at the heart of it. So something which is impossible to falsify. And conspiracy theories are also highly mutable. So even if you do manage to show an untruth to it, they can mutate to allow them to create new lies that then help them to explain why So, there's the conspiracy ever grows. And because of that core feature of every conspiracy theory, people want to engage with it, but you can't. One of the things that we do in training when we're teaching people how to deal with conspiracy theories is we tell them that the height of irrationality is to try and falsify a non-falsifiable hypothesis, because you can never do it. They'll always find a way to mutate the conspiracy. So engagement and the trap of engagement, which is driven by our deep desire to correct people who are wrong and spreading lies, actually leads them to become seen by more people, having that normalization effect. So there's that one aspect, and the second is that conspiracy theories about Jews, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but they are so widespread that we find them in every type of work that we do. So as an example, the way that algorithms work on social media platforms is that once you've liked one conspiracy theory, they will send you more. And it doesn't matter what type of conspiracy theory. So in the pandemic, we did a study called Malgorithm, which showed that if you were viewing anti-vax and COVID denial conspiracy theories, the algorithm would feed you on Instagram QAnon and anti-Semitism, and vice versa. If you set up an account to look just at QAnon and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, it would feed you COVID denial and anti-vax. So what you see is the cross-fertilization of conspiracies and extremisms, which leads to their hybridization, and it actually leads to an incredibly dynamic environment in which it's really difficult to track what's going to do well when. So we don't even know where to put resource for countering that disinformation, if that's the approach that you want to use. But really it's because conspiracy theories they're chewy, crunchy content for social media platforms. They love them, and they also know that, unlike, say, a news article, if you show someone a news article, they click on the link, they go to another website. That's not good for you, for your business. What you want to do is keep them in a captive content environment. And a captive content environment is where you're the monopoly provider of that content. So actually, for conspiracy theories, in no other place in humans, it's not acceptable. Like, you would never find it in the newspaper. You'd never find it in most mainstream media sources. It's primarily the digital news sources in which you see the proliferation of this kind of content. So what you've created is a digital only environment in which people are trapped in an algorithmically amplified, driven, accelerated loop of disinformation that then reinforces and self-reinforces and self-reinforces. So I think those two things are worth noting.
Thanks. So what I get from that is, no matter how outraged I am, don't feed the trolls.
So our first ever report was called Don't Feed the Trolls, looking at the mathematics of how platforms worked. And look, if we're going to disrupt the way that they work at a fundamental level, one thing that Amy and I are absolutely certain about is that because it's so profitable for platforms to host this kind of content, they are unlikely to do anything about it unless there are costs. Like, you can't have a system in which something is highly profitable. This is a very successful business model. And the only way now for change is for quite significant intervention with the generation of cost. And we can talk about CCDH's policy platform, if you want, later on in the questions.
Well, I think that's a good transition to talk about solutions. Amy, you're outspoken about the fact that solutions to anti-Semitism cannot undermine protections of liberal democracy. What options are available to us that can protect us from hate without undermining free speech protections?
Yeah. Well, I just want to first address sort of a misunderstanding, intentionally perpetuated misunderstanding here, which is that somehow social media companies are obligated to give free speech to everyone. Social media platforms are private platforms in the same way that any place that is a private institution, right? A restaurant, a business, whatever it may be, has rules of the road, no shirt, no service, whatever it may be. So too, social media platforms have terms of service, and they're obligated to live up to them. And so what this report shows, and what I think any of us who do work in this space know, is that X and so many other platforms are simply not living up to their terms of service, to their responsibilities to protect their users, including Jewish users in this case, but certainly many, many others. And similarly, I think if we're talking about what it means to, liberal democracy, inclusive democracy, it means everyone is able to live and work and operate safely and freely. And so when specific communities are unable to do that on certain spaces, whether it's on a social media space or in their schools or whatever it may be, that also fundamentally undermines the protections of liberal democracy for our communities. And in particular, I would say, I know that there have been we've talked a little bit about how inauthentic some of this activity might be on social media in terms of bots and other inauthentic activity. That's also intended to undermine the protections of liberal democracy by creating the perception that certain views and extremism are far more pervasive than it actually is. And so everything that's happening here in terms of how the social media companies and X in particular are navigating this, from failing to live up to their terms of service, from claiming that this is somehow a speech issue as opposed to their obligation to protect their users, and from the ways in which this anti-Semitic and broader hateful activity is being used to marginalize and attack and ostracize and ultimately remove Jews and others from certain spaces, in addition to creating an inauthentic picture of what reality is, none of that advances democracy. And so we can both directly confront anti-Semitism through a variety of tools and policies that I'm sure we'll talk about now, and do so in a way that is both true to the civil rights and liberties everyone deserves, including free speech, which we are all entitled to in a variety of places, even if we are not entitled to it in private social media platforms like X. And we can do so in a way that is also really clear-eyed about the real threats that exist. And so I'll say, we talk a lot about how the ways in which we actually confront anti-Semitism are inextricably linked with the ways in which we build broader democratic resiliency in our society, just as building broader democratic resiliency requires us to directly and specifically confront anti-Semitism because of, as we've been talking about, how uniquely it is used as a tool to undermine our democratic norms and institutions and our communities. And so this includes, I'm sure we'll talk about Section 230 and the ways in which it's a tool that specifically gives social media platforms cover to not live up to their obligations to their users. And there's a ton of specific policies that we would like to see the federal government implement. I think we also need to be realistic about what's possible with Washington, D.C. right now, and the fact that this is a problem with global reach that requires global solutions. So thinking about what each of us can do on the state and local levels and in our own communities is existential. And so that includes teaching media and digital literacy. This is something that we can do on the local and state levels by advocating for curricula in our schools, by requiring this in our own community centers and civic spaces, and empowering coaches and caregivers and others who are on the front lines, not just with young people, but frankly with all of us, to be smarter and better consumers of the news, to know that what they're seeing is not real, to understand how it's being used as a way to pit us against one another, to ultimately manipulate us. There's a ton of incredible research from a number of partners, including our friends at Peril at American University, and the different ways to do this. And it's something that each of us can do both in our own lives and our own families and places of work, and also something that we can advocate for on the state and local levels in terms of our schools and governments to advance as well. It's also investing in the broader infrastructure of democracy at a time when we're seeing democracy under threat in so many forms, whether it's voting rights or other attacks aimed at marginalizing communities, and dehumanizing and demonizing us. It's pushing back against that so that those ideas aren't given further normalization and mainstreaming at a time when we already know they're so pervasive on platforms like X. And so when we invest, and of course there's very specific policies like investing in Title VI in the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Ed, which protects Jewish students on campus, investing in hate crimes prevention grants, investing in nonprofit security grants, all of which have been deeply politicized, cut, frozen, or otherwise used as a sort of political tool by the federal government over the past year. And so we know that there are tools that we have, both specifically to keep the Jewish community safe and to invest in the broader democratic resiliency that helps inoculate us against this hate and extremism in the first place, we need to have the wherewithal to do it, even as we recognize on the federal and global level, there's so much more work that needs to be done from a policy perspective, as challenging and long-term and hard as that might be.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, that's a good reminder of not normalizing it. It doesn't have to be this way. Tools exist, policies exist that can change it. We don't have to just accept the way that social media is, which I want to have time to get to our audience's questions. I do want to ask Imran if you have any insight on this question as well, though, before we get to that, what moderation tools exist, what moderation tools work. You mentioned that community notes don't work. What can be done to improve these platforms?
Yeah, I mean, we did a scale analysis of community notes last year, looking at their efficacy in the election period in countering disinformation, and found they were incredibly ineffective. I mean, moderation can be effective, but X is failing to use it properly. It's just that simple. Like you can moderate social media platforms at scale. Platforms are able to do it. It's expensive, but they can do it. And part of the reason why they don't feel they have to do it is unique special protections given to social media platforms in US law. In the US in particular, it's not just that there's no regulation, no consequences, there's laws to protect them from consequences. And actually, I mean, CCDH operates in London, Brussels, DC. We have an office in LA, and we are currently in discussions to open an office in Ottawa to work on Canadian legislation. But we are ruthlessly focused on costs for social media companies. My office in Washington is in DuPont Circle, the center of the consumer rights movement, Ralph Nader, all that stuff. And when otherwise, social media has positives and it's a really powerful tool. I remember in the pandemic when I moved to America in June 2020, it was the mechanism by which I felt love and succor, and I could express vulnerability and connect with people I really care about. It was an incredibly powerful way of making the world smaller, which is its original promise, was it not? The whole idea behind social media was that it would shrink the world. It would end racism and bigotry because it would actually make us more familiar with each other. And there's so much evidence to suggest that familiarity can breed, tolerance and acceptance and the formation of bonds between people, but it hasn't done that. It's done quite the opposite because of the way that in particular content algorithms which sort through the billions of people's worth of content every day and then create an addictive news feed for each individual. Even though that's the way that we experience social media, we don't see everyone commenting all the time because that would be impossible. So it's ordered specifically. Even though that exists, social media companies are never held liable for any problems that causes. So whether that is eating disorder content that's shown 10,000 times to a child that leads them to think it's normal to go on a 300 calorie a day diet or to cut themselves, and they go on to do so, there is no liability. So we've asked ourselves the question of how do we create costs for those negative externalities, as the economists would put it, for the problems created by an otherwise positive industry. And we've identified three types of costs, which are different in different countries. So there's regulatory costs that can be imposed, and in the UK and EU, I was the first witness to give evidence for the UK's Online Safety Act in 2021. That became law in 2023 and is coming into force now. In the European Union and Brussels, we've got the Digital Services Act. So, the EU and UK combined is 0.8% of the US, is around 80% the size of the US economy. This is a quite sizable economic bloc that said, actually, if you're going to operate here, you need to have systems in place to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't spread, isn't amplified over other stuff, that harmful stuff is looked at. We also advocate for transparency laws. So what most people on this call probably won't know is that we were actually sued by Elon Musk 2 years ago for the act of doing research. essentially their lawsuit, it wasn't a defamation lawsuit, it wasn't that we were wrong with our data. His lawsuit said that our terms of service say that you can only use our research, our X, to view content. You can't use it to research, which is mad. And we won that case. In fact, Amy and I shared Amy's previous work on Charlottesville. It was the same attorney who defended CCDH on that case as well, Roberta Kaplan. And we won that case. But so creating transparency so that we can actually understand how we are being manipulated. And I think that's a really powerful way for if you're going to have high quality education at school level, you need to be able to tell them, well, this is the mechanisms that are being used to distort the lens through which you see the world. Actually explain the parameters of that distortion. So there's transparency is necessary. You've got regulation, you've got litigation, and in the US in particular, in Europe we regulate, in America you guys litigate, and litigation was the heart of how we started to create safety standards in the automobile industry. It's how so many consumer rights have been established and enforced through the litigation system. That would require reform of the way that we currently hold social media companies liable. So something called Section 230 reform, and that getting the right configuration of that. There's a lot of very clever lawyers thinking about that moment, and we're working on that. And then finally, the market. So the reason why Elon actually sued us is because our research showed that when he took over X, there was a tripling in the volume of anti-African American hate. There was a substantial increase in anti-Semitic hate on his platform. And that led to advertisers flooding off. It cost him $100 million in recurring revenue. And so he sued us saying, how dare you cause me to lose money, when all we were doing was holding up a mirror to his platform. And I think that what that shows is that the market, the advertisers don't want to be advertising on a system that is spreading hate, because it causes them reputational damage. And so by doing our research, what we do is we create that pressure on advertisers to use their market power in the right way. So those are three ways in which we create costs for social media companies for the production and distribution of hate and disinformation.
Thank you, Imran. And I think that I'm looking at the questions that have come in from attendees, and I think that touches on probably the most asked question is, okay, there's anti-Semitism on X, what can we do about it? It looks like the second most asked question is about bots. When you identify these increases in anti-Semitic content, how do you verify that those trends reflect genuine user activity rather than, amplification from bots and coordinated networks? What role do bots play in this?
You can't verify it. All we can look at is the effects of it. We can tell you that it's being amplified, but I can't tell you who's amplifying it. And you're asking a good question, which is, well, couldn't this be our enemies? Couldn't this be countries that are seeking to divide us and damage our country? Yes, you're right. Who would possibly be able to tell whether or not it's bots? Only the platform themselves, because only they have the IP level data. Only they can identify where that person is, what they're doing, blah blah, etc. So it's a real problem for us. Now, Elon Musk, when he bought X, said that 10% of the he said something crazy. He tried to get out of the deal, remember? Like, he actually didn't want to buy it, and he said it's all bots. It's not real. And he came up with a crazy number for the percentage of bots and said, don't worry, I'm the world's greatest engineer, I'm going to fix it. So theoretically, there should be no bots on X because he's dealt with it, right? But we know that they're actually rife on X as well. We see low follower count, very high activity, very clearly structured interactions such that they're trying to elevate certain content. But we can't tell for sure. And again, that's why in one respect, we're the Center for Countering Digital Harms. We're not the center for rewriting your business model and your code, because we don't, that's not my job. My job is to identify the result of a failure to deal with these predictable problems. And you're damn right that we have created a weak point I think of everything through medical metaphors because I was a medic many years ago, and it's like we've put a central line into the heart of our nation, and we've just, a central line like straight into the aorta, and then we've said anyone can put whatever they want in there. Mr. Putin, Xi Jinping, the Ayatollah, you go for it, guys. They are injecting bile and hatred into our nations because, of course, they want to kill the body politic. But there are just enough bad actors domestically too. So, I think it's a mix of the two, and differentiating between the two is not something we can do. I would argue it's not massively meaningful either, because in the end, what you are dealing with is the externalities of that, and it's about the prevalence of hateful stuff. Now, we know that platforms can identify hateful stuff. They've got the AI to do it. And they could decide that we are not going to amplify that stuff. We're going to give it a lower weighting in the algorithm. And that's not what happens, clearly.
Yeah. Well, I want to be conscious of everyone's time. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful conversation. This is really a fascinating report, and we'll make sure to send it around after this call. Amy, I would love if we could just close with a few words of, you're the expert on anti-Semitism. I know a lot of us are seeing some, vile stuff on our feeds. And I'd love to hear, kind of your closing message to our audience before we end the webinar.
Yeah. Well, look, in many ways, as depressing as some of the content we covered here today is, and the findings of this report are, it also gives me hope, right? Because it's partnerships like this that actually make clear there's a broader based understanding of how anti-Semitism is inextricably linked with the democratic resiliency and with the democratic norms and values that we need to fight to protect. And so for everything Imran just described in terms of how, whether authentic or not, what we're seeing on social media is being used by foreign and domestic actors to tear our democracy apart, to pit communities against one another, to sow distrust and polarization. I think there's also an increasing awareness by many that that's actually the goal here. And so I'm finding some hope in partnerships like ours with CCDH, with the work that we do with our partners around the country on the national and local levels, because people are kind of sick and tired of what they're seeing. They're sick of the polarization. They're sick of the rising violence. They are sick of being told that everything is broken down into the zero-sum binary framework, when the vast majority of us are able to actually hold complexity and nuance and reject polarization and extremism at a time when we're being force-fed it on social media and in so many other ways. And so, as like I said, as dark and depressing as some of this content has been, I also hope it gives people hope that there are many of us who are working together, many of the folks on this webinar included, to not only understand it, but to address it and make clear that it is not reality, and that we all have an obligation to do something, and that we're all capable and possible of doing something about it on our own levels and in our own communities, even at a time when the problem seems so big and daunting, on the social media level or on the sort of global and national scale of policy solutions. So I hope that people are also coming away from this with a feeling like there are specific things they can do in their communities and in their own lives, whether it's being smarter and better consumers of social media, not feeding the trolls and engaging, advancing media and digital literacy, and working across communities to advance the sort of policies and coalitions that fundamentally recognize that the fight against anti-Semitism is the fight for our democracy and fighting for our democratic institutions, fighting for safe social media spaces, and so much more is inherent to the broader fight against anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Imran. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll see you all later.